welcome back to Cafe CLIL number 6. Phil, have you got your coffee?
I have indeed, yeah.
It's quite mild here, and it's a good context for us to talk about materials. You know, thinking about what we're wearing, we're going to talk about CLIL materials today.
Yeah.
And we've got a nice contribution from colleague Amanda McLaughlin, which we'll add at some point. But let's make a start with the question you raised, Phil. So what characterizes or should characterize CLIL materials? And I mean, that's a very broad question. And let's see where we go with that when we pick it apart.
Well, there's so many things that one can say there, but I suppose the first thing that I don't want to say involvement of the students, because we're going to come on to that. You know, obviously we want students to be involved. I don't want to start with that because it's kind of too obvious, and I think it'll come into anything that we say. But for me, it's the thing that we put at the top of our 7 principles. If you remember, we wrote 7 principles of materials writing in our book. Just to be awkward, we said 7 because usually there's 10. No? Meister wrote 10. I'm not sure how many Tomlinson came up with, but there were probably more than 10. I think there were 5 actually of Tomlinson. We'll probably mention him later. We had 7 just to be awkward. 7's a magic number, actually, Keith. We're not very commercial, are we? Look, there's the book. There's the book, and it's actually chapter 7. And one did enjoy writing it, and because we could put all that stuff down that we believed in. And the first one that we put of the 7 is the primacy of task and the text-task relationship. We can come on to that later, but the primacy of task. In other words, what I was trying to say there with that was that the kids have got to know what to do.
Yeah.
And there you go. That sounds a really stupid thing to say, but it's really important because in lots and lots of research, L1 research, go back to Berkeley, for example, where they researched about mathematics, failure in mathematics in the States, in California in that particular case, and they found that it wasn't actually necessarily the conceptual aspect of the mathematics, but rather the instructional aspect. And so the procedural aspect, it was, kids were saying it was the fact mathematics is very procedural, isn't it? Very process led. And so they said the kids didn't actually know what to do. It wasn't a case of them not necessarily understanding mathematics, although math is a lot of how you have to do it. And so the primacy of task, it seems to me that if that was L1 research, and when you move into L2, when you move into CLIL, it's very, very important to get the instructions right. And writing instructions is actually very difficult in when you're a materials writer. It's something that both of us would have encountered. So the primacy of task, what have the kids got to do? If the kids know what they've got to do, then something like text isn't a problem, because the text itself becomes a tool to do things. So we'll get onto this later, but that's the big one for me, the primacy of task. And we did put that at number 1 of the 7.
And I also, just to mention, when you say what the students are expected to do, I keep thinking back to the vocational schools that we've both worked in, and teachers with whom we've worked in Austria. It's all about doing stuff, isn't it? The students are, I think of the soil chemistry laboratory work, they've got their hands on the soil, and so actually having a vocational context is a wonderful setting for going about learning the subject material. And in a way, I keep coming back to you saying hacemos cosas.
We do things, yes.
It is all about what the students are expected to do. And once that's clear, then we can make decisions about how we embrace language within that doing stuff. And I keep talking about the organizational structures of the concepts, where we can then make choices about where we embed language. But it's the actual doing, I think, that's the foundation.
Well, another way of looking at it, Keith, again, I'm thinking this spontaneous as you speak, but another way of looking at it is how not to do it. And that's often a way in, isn't it, to what we would consider to be good materials writing, whether it's in a textbook, or whether it's a digital platform, or whether it's taking in a tire with soil and planting, the pansies, as in your Bulgarian example. No?
Yeah. Yeah.
But what not to do? Well, that, precisely from what you say, I don't like I don't like that educational paradigm that says read the text and answer the questions that follow.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that has been such a dominant paradigm in education in general. I'm not just talking about language
Yeah.
teaching. Such a
Yeah.
dominant paradigm that the very notion of text becomes frightening for kids because the whole point of a text for 18 years of their lives is to read it, is to answer the questions that follow, which is not the case when they get into real life. That's not
No.
what you do with
I mean,
text.
I frequently talk about take the text off the page and put it in their mouths because in materials design for me, if I'm if I'm presented with a chunk of linear text, I immediately want to have a look at how the ideas are organized and see if I can chop it up in some way
Yeah,
and then make it a manipulable activity where they're still reading,
yeah, of
but
course.
putting things back in the right order or transferring that content into another diagrammatical form physically. It's the doing of that manipulation, I think, that allows students to communicate what they're reading. And so I often talk about read to talk activities with groups of teachers and ultimately getting it off the page.
What is the point of the text? That's right. What is the point? The text for me, particularly in CLIL, is a tool to do something else. And
Yeah,
often in language teaching, it's not. Well, I respect the idea that, we also kids need to develop reading strategies.
yeah, yeah,
That's, as you were saying before, that's also a problem nowadays, no, with this kind of quick reading that kids do, different kind of reading. They don't tend to do the
yeah,
kind of reading that
yeah,
we did in the
yeah,
past. I mean, they will eventually, I suppose, but it's true there is that aspect of a text. But I think in CLIL, I've always, as a materials writer, I've always used text as a springboard to do something else. And as you say, chopping it up, you don't necessarily begin with the text either. The text can
yeah,
be whatever the text is. It might be a written or it might be written, it might be spoken, it might be a video clip, it might be anything, but it's not dominating the scene, as it were. It's just a tool for
yeah.
doing other
It's
stuff.
true. I mean, there are some cases. Um, I often sound like I'm bashing Bulgarian education, but it's only because there are lots of examples I can get my fingers on quickly. And one is a history textbook which was translated from Bulgarian into English, and they left out all the pictures. It's literally a textbook, you know.
Yeah. Yes.
And working with that, what we had to do with the history colleagues was really try and reinsert all the contextual images that were in the original.
Yes.
And I think, it's still, I think it is quite true to say that education is text-led still, generally speaking. I know I'm generalizing, but I think it is. It's text-led, and the approaches to learning, particularly, working towards exams that students have to do,
Yeah.
are largely text-led as well. It's whereas the vocational system tends to have more non-text opportunities for learning for students because they want to work in a chemical engineering context or I mentioned the soil chemistry laboratory ultimately to do a job. Yeah. And I think that's sometimes missing in general education, that purpose.
Yeah, okay, but I think we've got to be slightly careful. It's interesting you say about textbook. I was thinking about that as I had my walk to the beach this morning, and we don't question the word textbook. It's such a common phrase, isn't it? But it means a book with texts, of course. And those texts, of course, depending on the subject, might also be, a graph is a text. No, they might be also visuals themselves. But as you say. I think education has been dominated since print began almost, by text. But I think
Yeah,
we've got to be slightly careful there, Keith, because we're going to talk about CLIL here. And so when we move into CLIL, we're talking about visibility. We talk about, you talk a lot about making things visible. That's a great phrase as well, making things visible to the students. And in CLIL, what we're trying to make visible is the language of, we've said before, the language of academic, of academic study. And so,
yeah,
so
yeah,
what you find, of course, is text genre. And so I think there's been this move, particularly the Gratz group as well, moving towards getting kids more making things visible, but also making perhaps those text genres visible as well. That might be another session. But certainly you've talked about cognitive discourse functions and, Christian Dalton Buffer's work, and the very fact that given the subject, certain cognitive discourse functions will dominate over others, and the kids have got to master them.
Yeah.
It's not the same. You say describe something or define something or explain something. Those things are very different. And so
Yeah.
different texts, not only visual text, but if you've got a graph and you ask the kids to write about the graph, it's probably description. Then it might get on to explanation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the kids do have to master in the end the production of those things. So we've got to be a little bit careful there. But I know what you mean. I know what,
Sure. Sure. I mean,
particularly.
in terms of input, Phil, I guess in this discussion, I'd quite like to keep the term text to mean printed word
Yeah,
rather than graphs,
okay,
because just to avoid
okay.
confusion for myself, because when I talk about visualizing concepts, frequently try to find very good examples from teachers' subject textbooks where there is a linear text, but it can easily be presented in a different structural form to help students process it. And it might. An example I use is a published example of the advantages and disadvantages of coal as a source of producing electricity, and that's a big tree diagram. Basically, it's already been published that way. And what the students have to do is they get all the aspects chopped up and they have to put them in the advantages, disadvantages. It's a reading activity, but they speak while they read and sort. And maybe they disagree with each other. They agree, disagree, compromise to put the text in its tree diagram form.
That's,
I think, in CLIL, just to say about why that's important for CLIL, that's how CLIL creates communication, I think. It's by
well,
exploiting those visual forms of content in order to, as I say, get it off the page and into their mouths.
absolutely. I mean, so I was laughing at your dog barking in the background there, but it's not a
They're
problem.
patrolling.
You're carrying on very smoothly there. Yeah. Was it Willis talked about vox pop content now? And often the problem with a lot of textbooks is that it's, supposedly the kids will be interested about talking about pop stars when actually they're embarrassed to do that in front of their old git teachers who actually might only be 30 years old. And when you talk about coal, you say, right, let's do coal on a Friday afternoon. You think, oh my God. But of course, what you're saying there, and it's great, and it's what I've also tried to do is when you're faced with that content is part of geography, let's say, you've got to do it, and you've got to do it in a foreign language if you're doing hard CLIL. And so how do you make that
Yeah,
available and interesting to students? Well, you do it by making by breaking the concepts down, but you break them down by the interaction, by the procedures that you decide on precisely. I've got a classic training thing. I haven't used it for a while now, but there's an industrial town in the Basque Country called Beasain, and it's very small. It's got a population of 14,000 people, but it's very important because it's got CAF, and CAF is it's a multinational. It's a multinational from a tiny town, and so it's perfect for geographical purposes, particularly talking about
right,
economy
right.
and things. You get any why would you talk? Why would kids want to talk about energy sources and towns and bear sign and industry on a Friday
Yeah,
afternoon?
yeah, yeah,
Because they wouldn't. But what my activity does, and I used to use it for training, was again like you, was to break it down. And all I did was I wrote down three questions. So instead of them looking at the statistics which was the original activity, which was in BAST, I asked a question to say, how many was it? How many the population of Bearside is 14,000. How many do you think are men, and how many do you think are women? And then there are various. And of course, in order to get that answer, you've got to think, okay, this town is dominated by a big heavy industry steel, even though it's only got 14,000. So you get them thinking, and you get them thinking on a Friday afternoon because they want to know the answers later. They're very
yeah,
pleased if they get close to the answers. So it's like your coal example. who wants to talk about heavy industry and energy on a Friday afternoon?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All you need to do is manipulate the procedure, Keith, and of course, they want to know the answers. And of course, I train the teachers to not give them the answers. Not you don't give the kids. They don't give the kids the answer straight away. They just say, "Why do you think that? Why do you think it's more men?" Because most kids say men, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Men and women. And of course, they're wrong. It's women because it's a service industry, which is a product of the heavy industry. But
Right.
it doesn't matter that they get it wrong. So as a training tool, it was quite neat. But I was talking about the same thing, Keith, about
Yeah,
the breaking down of concepts by the procedures you choose.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the aspects of good CLIL materials are, we, we started with one principle, the primacy of task, but there are the other 6 in our book, and we've got a contribution from Mandy. Maybe we could bring
Yeah,
Mandy in now, if you like, because she
let's bring it
mentions a couple of these
in.
important factors. So let's just pause and bring Mandy in now.
Yeah.
Well, Mandy, thanks for joining us. It's great to have another voice in our discussion with Phil, and we're going to talk about CLIL materials this week. And because of your professional CLIL materials writing background, we thought we could ask you to chip in with, your 2 or 3 takeaways for colleagues on what characterizes and what concerns when you're writing materials for CLIL. What 2 or 3 things that are in your mind when you're doing that?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a delight to be here with you. So yeah, when I'm writing materials, I think for me the most important thing, well, not the most important thing, there's lots of important things, but one of the things I think that you need to have very much in the front of your mind as you're writing is the scaffolding, including various different types of scaffolding is really important, whether that's through images, whether it's through bolding in the text itself, whether it's through giving various answer options, like for multiple choice questions, having various different answer options rather than having open-ended questions, just to make sure that, all of the learners are able to access the content and that all of the learners are able to interact with the activities that you're writing.
Yeah.
And then another thing that's probably really important, and I know that Phil talks a lot about this, and a lot of the kind of ideas that I have behind this come from conversations I've had with Phil in particular, would be the sequencing of the activities. And it seems really obvious, but it doesn't always happen in materials writing, that the sequencing goes from, the simpler types of tasks to more complex types of tasks. And as you talk about in your book with the mixing desk metaphor, making sure that you're not turning up everything all at the same time. So really being very aware of what kind of thinking you're asking the learners to do and where the difficulty is in the task for them, and making sure that you don't jump from kind of one level of difficulty right up to a much higher level of difficulty without adding stages to help them build towards that in. So it's kind of having that clear in your head where you're going and how you're going to get there,
And so now we've heard Mandy, her take on sort of 2 takeaways that we asked her to offer to our listeners and viewers. And she focuses on scaffolding, the importance of scaffolding within task design and materials design. And she also focuses on what she says she's picked up from you is the sequencing of activities in materials design. You want to say anything about either of those?
Nice of her to pick up on that. It's very nice of her to say that. Well, perhaps we could deal with the 2. I mean, what would you prefer to talk about? Scaffolding? You want to talk about scaffolding to start
Well,
with?
Scaffolding, I think, continues nicely on from what we've been saying about visualizing.
Yeah.
And because the idea of the scaffold is obviously important for all learning, but plays a very central role, I think, in CLIL. Because of the structural side of scaffolding,
Yes.
Almost imagining going up the side of a building, but up the side of any concepts, I think the scaffold itself can be shaped to fit in with whatever the concept structure is. And I think that's the magic of CLIL. We make all of that visible, I think, whether it's trees, tables, flows, cycles, using and exploiting those images, those diagrammatical frameworks, is part and parcel of what we do in our book, is take that structure and then make decisions about where you put the crucial academic language. So to be able to support students in their output when they get to speaking or writing about what they've dealt with as input material.
Yeah, I mean, Mandy's talking about design. I think she's kind of hinting. She doesn't say it specifically, but she's talking about differentiation. And so, I suppose she's talking about the UDL, the Universal Design for Language, which I also had to use in the textbooks here. And she's talking about making things bold, about the way you present materials, actually the visual and aesthetic aspect, if you like, also of let's say primary materials. Mandy writes primary and secondary materials. You have to be very careful about the way that you present those materials on the textbook. And UDL principles are very good, and they of course are scaffolding. My only slight problem with that is, if you go back to Vygotsky's original idea of scaffolding, he said that in the end you have to take it away, But of course UDL doesn't really consider that. I don't think. I'm not against it, but there is a point where you say, well, okay, we've got to start giving them texts which have to be challenging in some ways. It's still scaffolding, okay, but they have to be more challenging, and it's a little bit difficult to know how to do that. I think also, she talked about sequencing, and for me, sequencing is scaffolding. I think that's what she meant, actually.
Okay.
Sequencing for me is inherent to scaffolding, and it's something that Tomlinson doesn't talk about in his famous book about material. It's interesting. No? I think that where she says that you mustn't turn up all the volume controls at the same time, that's a crucial point. That's an absolutely crucial point to make. It's a brilliant point she makes there, and very simply. And it's true. And I think that if you understand the concept of sequencing, and that's where, if you're a language teacher, if you start doing some soft CLIL, you get to understand it more, is that the length of the sequence. What Mandy's saying is that there are certain points in those sequences that you will identify as turning up something. You're going to turn up the concepts, you're going to turn up the procedures, or you're going to turn up the language. And when you do that, well, that itself becomes a kind of scaffolding. Now, again, how are you going to turn it up? That's again a technical question, but I like the fact that she picks on sequencing and scaffolding. In fact, you could just take those 2 points, and that would be sufficient for a discussion on materials development for me.
Yeah. Like you said, we're likely to go off in various directions, and they'll be maybe themes for from other sessions of Cafe CLIL, Phil. There's nothing to stop us picking up on one of them. I think it's a great idea.
Well, I think particularly, we've said before, but if you take Mandy's point about sequencing, if you're aware of the way that a sequence, the shape of a sequence, now the way it behaves, if you're trying to break down content, you've mentioned coal. I've been talking about the concept of different types of industry. If you know that that's going to take quite a while to do, then if you know when you're going to turn that language volume up, and the way that you're going to turn that language, how are you going to do that in the materials if it's a textbook, for example? Or taking your point, Keith, you're going to make the language visible. Well, you're going to make the academic language visible, and that's the big thing about CLIL, isn't it? We're making the academic language visible in your case about coal. No? So that conversation that takes place about the coal will, in the end, bring out that language, although you might be turning up the procedural volume there. No?
Yeah. I mean, with very young learners, to get away from the topic of coal, with our preschoolers, we teach the concept of pollination, and we do it with a wonderful activity where we take kind of powdered crayon and place it on images of different flowers. The children have cotton wool, and they're dressed up as bees, and they have to visit flowers and take with their cotton wool the pollen to another flower and leave a little bit behind. you know, it doesn't have to be text-based. And I think even as we go higher up the BICS to CALP continuum, you know, to take Cummins' very early schooling is largely BICS-based, and then as the students approaching graduation, it's as CALP as it can get. That doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to be, all should be text-based, I think. You know, I think some of the dynamics of early learning could easily travel higher up the curriculum.
Well, of course, but let's not confuse ourselves here. I love that. The very fact that you dress up the kids as bees to do that I would say that dressing up as bees is materials. Those are materials.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are the materials those are the materials you're employing for that, to break down that concept at that cognitive age. That's absolutely brilliant example. Actually, please send me a photograph of that.
I will do.
Use that in training. I say, what are these kids? What do you think the conceptual of this is?
It's wonderful. And you know, so the drama is important at that age. Of course it is, to be able to take up a concept and understand what's happening. But I think, you know, that's the advantage the vocational colleges have, that they deal with text a lot. Of course they do, but they also use drama. I mean, the soil chemistry in the laboratory, they're going to be chemists, these students, when they graduate, but they're playing the role of the laboratory worker in assessing the different types of soil that they're working with. And that's what I mean by as we go up the CALP scale, still having that aspect of role play, for example, for students, so that they experience rather than read. And I sound like I'm having a go at reading. Of course, it's important to develop these skills, but not at the expense of all of the other thinking skills.
Well, you're also talking about a pre-reading age probably there with those kids. Now, I don't know what age they are when they're doing the stuff about pollination. And again, you know, for me, the dressing up is it's a form of scaffolding, no? That's a form of scaffolding. It must, you're trying to make the concepts visible to the kids through drama. Drama is a form of scaffolding. Again, that's the problem with the word scaffolding. I'm not getting at Mandy there. I mean, it's very important what she said, but the point about scaffolding is it's a very broad term. You know, you could spend a whole training course on the word scaffolding and what exactly does it mean. And when you get into CLIL, it's particularly significant. Now, I was before we came on, Keith, I was just looking at the classic take on materials development, which is of course in an ELT context, and it's Brian Tomlinson's book, no? Materials development in language teaching, and I did read some of it. I've never come through that route really, but I have read some of it, and I do know. I was actually just trying to go back to his principles, and there were 5 of them, and I'm just saying it now because it relates to what you said. He talked about materials should be learner-centered. Fine. He said they should be authentic. Okay, whatever that means. He said they should be engaging. Sure. Sounds to me like dressing up as bees is engaging. They need to be adaptable. I think we know what that means. And he said they need to promote interaction, and that's exactly what we think as well, particularly in CLIL. But there's a big but here, I think. Obviously, Brian wasn't interested in CLIL. Well, he wasn't interested in it. I think the first edition of the book was before the CLIL acronym, but in subsequent editions, he didn't really look at content-based learning. Maybe he didn't want to, you know, complicate matters. But it seems to me that what Tomlinson was saying, he was saying that all those 5 things were supporting what he called communicative competence. Well, okay. Well, I'm all for supporting communicative competence as well, Keith. But for me, there's something missing there, because if you talk about supporting communicative competence, fine. Why are you supporting communicative competence? Why do you want your students to be communicatively competent? Well, in a CLIL context, that's because we want them to be communicatively competent about subject disciplines. We want them in the end, in your lesson, we want them to be able to say, this is what the insects do. You know, they go to the flowers and they do da-da-da, and that's what we want. So communicative competence for me is a kind of vague phrase. But when you look at it in CLIL, it's not. Because the whole point of CLIL is to make them competent in the academic language of subject disciplines. There you go. There's the big difference.
I think that's, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, obviously, the social cultural aspect has become more visible these days with the Common European Framework. But still, I could take you into any school here and you'd see a lexical, grammatical approach to foreign language teaching and learning. I mean, my daughter's case, she actually had a vocabulary teacher, a grammar teacher, and a talking teacher, 3 of them doing these different things, you know. And that's still the case. That's still the case. And I think, you know, what the great advantage that CLIL has in this aspect of materials design is the way we focus on thinking so much. You know, you've got, because the kind of verbal, sequential thinker that thrives in traditional language classrooms is not necessarily the person who's going to be a spatial thinker, you know, a visualizer of objects or spaces. And I think that's what CLIL offers. It does offer these variations on approaches to thinking through the structural, conceptual approaches that we try to bring to the front of learning. And there's a really wonderful book that's called Visual Thinking that explores how education is missing out on this aspect of the varieties of learners in all classrooms by going largely down the verbal sequential route. That's our 30 minutes.
Is it? Oh, God, yeah.
And I think that's the great advantage of CLIL. It's become clear to me, thinking about this theme and us talking about it together, that really it's if our colleagues do take on visualizing concepts and then looking at how to develop language through those structures, I think that's really what CLIL is all about.
Well, it's your famous phrase, isn't it? And that's the third one of our principles, you know, guiding input and supporting output. I always remembered that. I mean, you could reverse them, but I think it's better what you say, to guide input and to support output. That's good. I think we need another session on materials. I think we need to.
I think so. I mean, we have. I mean, Mandy's two points on scaffolding and sequencing. We've looked at sequences before, but we could explore scaffolding together. That would be fascinating to do.
It would, and I think we might be able to bring somebody else in as well to talk about that, maybe from perhaps a more pure language teaching.
Yeah, it would be good to have a perspective from a language.
Be very careful. You may be asked, whoever you are out there. We might bring you in for a couple of minutes. But yeah, I think there's more to talk about here, Keith. You know, which is good. I reckon.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's close there. It sounds like we've kind of got to the end of that particular phase of our discussion. We'll come back to maybe to materials again / scaffolding or something else.
Yeah. Okay. Great.